Welcome to the WellCast. The world has a lot to say. We're bringing a biblical perspective to those conversations.
All right. Hey, welcome back to another episode of the WellCast.
Hey, everyone.
I'm Jordan, and this is
Melissa.
And we are joined today by our friend Austin Hall.
Hello.
Yeah. Cue applause
Yeah.
from the sign.
Oh, you guys stop.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us today, man.
Yeah, thank you
glad
guys
you're
for
here.
having me. This is cool.
We are starting, you guys would be used to by now a little bit of a mini series sort of context. And one of the things we want to do is start to also incorporate stories into the podcast and help people's stories be more known, understood, and then people get a picture into God's big picture for his body and what he's been doing. And for the body of Christ, not God's body, obviously.
God's
but
big body.
yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
I realized the wording was strange on that as soon as I said it. And so today's a little bit of a hybrid. We want to talk a little bit about mental health in the church over the next couple weeks at least, and we'll see what that evolves into. But, I've gotten to know Austin over the last year or so.
Yeah, almost 2 years. We've been at the Well since August 22.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then our wives were in a women's group together.
They were. That was the initial connection. That's yes, I remember this
Women's
now.
Bible
So
I
thank
kept
you,
hearing
Melissa.
about this
It's so-
Melissa Denisi person too, and so it's
Mhm.
really fun. Like, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You guys came over to our house for dinner with the
Mhm.
Bergs. Yes,
Yeah, yeah.
I'm remembering now.
I'm happy to have connected that. See,
Thanks, Melissa.
That's on me.
Wow.
You're
Wow.
welcome.
The great facilitator. So we're, I think obviously, or maybe not obvious to some people, a storied history in the church with, we're very comfortable with the physical, the spiritual, but we don't always incorporate the mental into the physical.
Mm-hmm.
And, I grew up in a tradition that was not very comfortable talking about a lot of this stuff. And, but my mom, interestingly enough, was very comfortable. And so being raised by a single mom, she had terrible postpartum depression with me. And
Wow.
everyone had, told her, pray it away, do all the, all the sort of trite Christian things that people say to people who are struggling and they don't really know what to say, but maybe they want to try and be helpful. And none of it worked. And for the first time in her life, as sort of an oaky gal, went to a therapist, was for a season prescribed medication. It really, really helped her. And that changed her view of what it looked like to incorporate the mind into the body and the spirit and everything together. And so I was raised sort of in this sort of strange, like maybe the broader spectrum of our tradition didn't have a comfortability with talking about mental health, but my mom was very comfortable in talking about, hey, some people have this affliction and some people have this and some people have this for a season. So I was surprised when I found out that, some people don't have that view
Yeah.
in the broader church as a whole. In Austin, that's a big part of your story, right? And so, I guess wanted to open the floor to start with you and just say, hey man, like give us an intro to your background, who you are, and then also like let's talk about your journey from there.
Yeah. So I'm married. It's the first thing to mention. My wife and I have been married for 8 years, and a lot of my journey with mental illness, I think, took a huge uptick after we got married. And so in a lot of ways, I told Whit before I left this morning, I was like, I feel like you're equally as qualified to talk about this, if not more so, especially from the angle of helping somebody in the midst of it. But I grew up in the church. I grew up with two believing parents. Both of my parents had, pseudo-traumatic childhoods, and so we're very connected early on to the necessity of counseling and integrating that into a fully orbed faith. And so I kind of got that view. My dad was never opposed to things like counseling. Family members who had to take medication opened us up very early on to, hey, this would be important to consider as an option. My wife and I have been married. We have two girls. I grew up in the church, and I'd say for most of my life, I didn't really register that there were mental hurdles that I had to make. I remember struggling with just very visceral mood changes from a young age, but a lot of that is just, oh, that's just boys, you know what I mean? They're
Yeah,
like
you never
that.
know, teenager
Yeah, especially with teenagers, they'll struggle with depression and things like that. But mine was a little more serious. I was engaged in not a ton of, but a little bit of self-harm in high school, a lot of suicidal ideation, and then a lot of just threatening that as something that I was thinking about doing.
And along those lines, when would you say that you trusted Christ with your life?
Yeah. I had a moment as a 5-year-old where somebody presented what I'd call like the kind of traditional view. You know what I mean? Jesus wants to be your friend. You're a sinner. You're in need of a savior. When you die, you can go to be with him, kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a recollection of receiving that, but I think the first time I really understood the gospel was when I was 17 at a Wildwood discipleship camp.
Okay.
And they simulated something to the effect of the two ways we think of the gospel. One is this more kind of like, well, I've done these bad things and I need to now make up for that somehow to God. And it was a simulation, and we bit hook, line, and sinker on that. You know what I mean? That's the gospel, is I need to now show God that I'm sorry through these various acts. And then somebody comes, running out and says, he's paid it, it's over. And I remember just breaking down and sobbing, realizing my life up to that point had been, I'm a pastor's kid. There's this immense pressure that I feel to be something that I just can see in my heart I'm not, and trying to cover that up. And that was when the gospel really came home for me of, this is about Jesus rescuing me from not just my sin, but also my worst tendencies. And so 17, trusted Christ, immediately had this hunger to like know the Bible. I'd always been, I was not a reader, but immediately just started consuming the Bible in large chunks, which is weird for me. I do it in class, which was not great. So I was just like, I don't need to know Spanish. I need to know the Bible, but I should have been paying attention. So, I just began a journey of walking with the Lord from there, praying and getting into theology, trying to understand the Bible more. And
So then you're, you're still sort of up and down with mood swings and stuff like that through this process.
Yeah.
And what did that look like, high school, post-high school?
Yeah. In college, it was difficult because, I would just experience these like, so just to air it out, I believe it's bipolar 1, is what I was diagnosed with officially, just to put that out there. And one of the things that comes with that is, if you picture, the way my doctor explained it is, if you picture the normal range of human emotions like this, bipolar 1, you'll be, way above, way below, and it can happen really quick. And sometimes you're just not even aware of what the trigger was, and you could be going from just this really eccentric talk on, whatever it is, and you're really excited and you're thinking, oh, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. And then you could be experiencing crushing depression. People would be better off without me, kind of a thing. And so I remember having a lot of those fluctuations in college. And I remember people being really frustrated, and just thinking like, is this guy just the worst person, what I mean, alive? Like this, and I remember not understanding myself and just going, why am I like this? Like, how did I get like this? Because I know that I struggle with sin like everybody else, but this feels different. This feels like it's on 10.
So you could recognize that, okay, something's different here. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I felt like I wasn't playing with all the cards, and lo and behold, as the years went on, there were more and more things coming up where I was like, okay, there's like sin, there's the normal range of like, okay, I responded in an unkind way, or I responded in a way that was not, right. But this was like sudden, really intense anger, or like really crushing fear, you know what I mean? Or just this sense of like, I'm invincible, I'm never gonna die, you know what I mean? And I didn't know what that was. And it wasn't until 2020, during the most conducive time for people with mental illness, COVID-19.
Yeah.
That's sarcasm. It was really awful. But at the end of 2020, mood swings had become so severe that there were what should have been two small things that precipitated me to attempt to take my life. I ended up in a psychiatric facility at the top floor, which is not where you want to be, where they're assessing, like, are you going to be safe for us to put you back out there? The nature of what I had done and the nature of the attempt and the things they'd found led them to believe, like, hey, this person's in deep, deep crisis. And so so I spent 5 days there. I was terrified. It felt like being in jail. It was really scary. There were a lot of people there who, didn't make the assessment to come back out. And it was a very just spiritually dark environment as well. Feelings of a lot of guilt and shame, feelings of a lot of like, how did this happen? You know what I mean? Like I'd kind of woken up from, a dream I didn't remember, but I'd moved, kind of a thing. And so
you would say that there was like almost a crescendo of 2020 that led to that?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it was like everything had been really bad for a while, but I had been able to manage it. I had been able to get away with like, oh, that's just Austin. You know what I mean? He's just kind of like that. And I am excitable. I do get really into the things that I'm into. But it was always kind of like, I'm just a more melancholy person, right? But it was like, no, this is like persistent. And there are some people who are like nostalgic, you know what I mean? But then they get around people and they're better. There was nothing that felt like it was alleviating it aside from my time with the Lord. And then these kind of brief little spurts where I could see things improve for a time.
And at this point, could Whitney see this in you?
Yeah.
Was she okay?
So we got married, and I think for a while it was really strange to her of like, there are really small things that will set him off. There are really small things that will send him spiraling into like, maybe I shouldn't be here. You know what I mean? These people would be happier if I was gone. Those kinds of thoughts, right? And we all experience, we should all, in a healthy state experience like I kind of feel down today. You know what I mean? But you can notice it when you see like, okay, this is a normal, just sad part of life, but it's not like this level. Right. You know what I mean? Yeah. When I think of like King David despairing of life or Paul the Apostle despairing of life, I'm like, you had some good reason to be despairing of life. You know what I mean? Like you're in jail, you're beaten by the Romans, or people are out for your life. And they're like, I just don't even want to be. I'm like, yeah, got it. You know what I mean? But when you're in normally safe circumstances, you're exercising, all the other things are going on, and that's still happening to you, and your spouse is watching it, they're kind of like, something's off, you know what I mean?
Right.
And I'm not sure what, and I'm not sure how to help you. And so...
I remember in our first year of marriage, Jamie was really going through it, and she had never been treated for her really severe anxiety. And I remember like not having dealt with that personally, or at least myself. I just kept watching her fall off a cliff, that's the only way I knew how to talk. I'd never seen a panic attack before. And I was like, she just falls off a cliff and then hits bottom and then we regroup, Yeah. And so you even almost have to like be like, oh, this is happening to us. Yeah. You know what I mean? Right. Not necessarily like out there, it's here with us. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, because it's not, as part of what maybe I can talk about is, with other people, you do have this option of walking away, right? If you're in friendship with somebody dealing with mental illness, if you're in the church, you can insulate yourself, right? You can remove yourself. And there is a place for healthy boundaries, for sure. But when you're married to the person, there is not a lot of isolation that you can do. Like you're in it, and so I remember there were a lot of years where she would be hurt by things I would say, or she would just feel this sense of powerlessness and anxiety over like, I don't know what to do when you get like this. And I'm worried that something's going to happen. And so, what 2020 was, as horrific a time as it was for our family, was kind of the beginning of getting a name on this thing. There's something powerful about that, just naming it and saying, hey, here's what it is. Here's what we think some good, treatment might be. And then you can go on that journey. And So coming back from that facility, that was what began as a series of trying to find a medication that would work. And, oh, this one didn't. It made me gain 30 pounds and I feel sleepy all the time, you know, and then let's try this one. And, oh, this one makes my anxiety worse, but there's no suicidal ideation. Well, that's not a trade-off I want, you know?
Yeah.
So it's just a lot of like trial and error. And that's one of the difficult parts for me about, because I'm very pro like, hey, if your doctor thinks there's a medication that can help you, take it by all means. There's nothing scripturally against that. However, know that medicine is not a silver bullet a lot of times. It's a long process often to try to find something that will work. And sometimes you get something that works and it only works marginally. And then you go, I don't think this is what I want to do long term, you know, and your spouse has to really be in on it too, to kind of advocate if you're married. And if you're not, if you have close friends or family who can kind of watch and monitor and go, hey, I don't know if this one's doing what we want it to be doing. Or, hey, I know it doesn't feel like this one's working, but I actually see some improvement. And I want you to keep taking it, even though you feel like it's not, you know, the best.
That is so key, to have community who knows you well and well enough to speak in and speak the truth for you, to you. So powerful.
Yeah, because one of the recurring things for me has been going like, you know, you take it for a while or you get something that works for a while and then you go, is this even doing anything? You know, do I really need to keep doing this? Or dang it, I wish I could do X and I can't because I'm taking this. And I wish I was just normal. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then that feeling of like, I think I just need to come off of this. But having people who can remind you, hey, this is good. This is a good thing we're doing.
Yeah, I've seen that cycle a lot in friends and family. And, you know, I'm sure there are seasonal sort of like, this will help me in the season and these type of things. But I've also seen like, I'm feeling good. I don't think I need this anymore.
Right.
But the reminder is maybe this is part of feeling good, you know? And I mean, obviously I don't know if it needs to be said, but we don't think that like, if you're having any type of mental struggle, you need to run right to the doctor and have No. Largely our country's over medicated probably. Most likely. And, but what we're speaking to is that there is a large swath of the church who would be like, oh no, you know, that's a thing that you can't do. And I understood this as a really little kid because my mom said she had to go through all those barriers, right? Of people being like, you can't, you shouldn't, you don't trust God. You know, all the platitudes that people say to people. And she always knew that they were well-meaning, but overall, she just told me, look, if you have a headache, you take Advil and it helps. If you have diabetes, you take insulin and it helps. And if this helps your physical body, then let it help you, you know? And as a kid, I was like, makes sense.
That makes sense.
Let's play Legos.
And how brave of your mom to have that decades ago, because even now, if we're still kind of paralyzed with this, but for her to face that and fight for her own
for me that always points to exactly how bad it was too.
I'm willing to have these conversations and lose these people's respect or friendship or whatever. So which I imagine you still face some of that.
Yes. we did.
And I mean your story led us up to about end of 2020, walking through some of these things. I know it continues from there.
Yeah. So coming back, I had been really involved in our church at the time. I'd served in the junior high ministry for 4 years, high school ministry for 4 years, worship through music, Bible teaching, small group. So, we were members, like we were really in. And this was the church where I'd kind of grown up in adulthood. And so there was a lot of a high degree of trust that I had, for the vision and the kind of direction, theologically, practically. And we had we had an emphasis on like good Christian counseling, not just like Bible push-ups, you know what I mean? Where it's like, do 5, thou shalt not be anxious, you know what I mean? And then, that's what my dad calls them, is Bible push-ups. But
that's good, I'm gonna use that.
But I remember coming back and immediately sensing that like something was different. There was a stream of thought in our church at the time that now is kind of explicitly denying the reality of mental illness. And these were very powerful orbits. And it felt like during 2020, like it felt just culturally, everybody was like, whatever your like lean was, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
you dipped
rocketed
really
that.
hard into that
you
direction.
went extreme for sure.
And the problem is, as you said, I'm a high school teacher. That's my day job. A lot of my students report that they feel anxious and they feel depressed and you know, I need to be medicated is what they usually tell me. And they typically self-diagnose, you know what I mean? And that's never great to do. But when they'll talk to me about like what they think they have or why they need medication, I go, what time do you get to bed? And they're like 3 a.m., you know? And I go, okay, what are you doing before you go to bed? Oh, I'm on my phone and I'm watching this anime that's extremely violent, you know? And I had caffeine and, oh, my parents are also getting a divorce and blah, blah, blah. And you go through all the circumstances and you're like, you know, you can't control the divorce. That's hard. That's going to lead to some depression. Could you get to bed by 10 p.m.? Could you exercise? Could you not watch really violent content before, you know, at all maybe, right? You look at that and you go, I'm not sure medication is yet something we need to cross. Let's try these other things first. There's a whole other crew who you mentioned for whom it's like you exercise, you're getting to bed on time, you're practicing spiritual formation, you're doing all the things and they're not working. Maybe we could try medication. It's like, no. We don't do that. You know what I mean? We're too busy preaching Christ. You know what I mean? If people will just look at the glory of Jesus and you look at both ends of the spectrum and you go, medication as an option. Yes. You know, looking at Jesus, seeing the beautiful Savior who's going to put the world right one day. Amen. You know, the problem is this false dichotomy between those two things.
Yeah.
And it's as if this side doesn't have any kind of hope, any kind of metaphysical hope of like, hey, God exists. God is going to take care of me. And he's wired my body to work a certain way and my brain to work a certain way. And I should probably avoid certain content and I should try to do these things. But then it's as if this side says God isn't sovereign over the physical. He's only got the spiritual realm under his belt. You know what I mean? And if you leave this quote unquote spiritual realm, you're not trusting him anymore. And that was sort of where we ended up was, I mean, all to the point where a year prior when my wife gave birth to our first daughter, Addie, she was told not to get an epidural. And the reason for that was...
From the church?
From a woman who was fairly predominant.
Okay.
Yeah, she was fairly predominant at the time.
So not like a letter from the elders, but
no.
someone...
Yeah, no, nothing like that. But it was a and she was making the rounds, you know, telling all the pregnant women. And the reason is the Lord said, this is pain in childbirth is something that you're going to experience as a woman, and you shouldn't try to circumvent the fall, which is an act of God's judgment. And I remember thinking, like, you guys know me. My brain thinks in terms of theological categories. So immediately I'm like, that's bad exegesis. That's not true at all. And the argument for why is really a little more complicated maybe than we have time for. But the short version is God is the God of healing and new creation. And so Christians invented largely the medical field because they looked at sick and hurting people in the Roman Empire and went, hey, we should take care of these people. Right. So we want to affirm like the goodness of that. But that's just sort of an anecdote to show that was kind of in the milieu.
She was maybe at that point a representative of a larger sort of feeling
belief
in your community.
system.
It wasn't it was a very articulate, she was articulate of something that was hovering in the background and that you could feel when you would talk to people. And again, like there were really great people who did not think that, who would have sat that person down and gone, oh, stop that. You know what I mean? Knock that off. Doctors, people in the medical field who were like, no, by all means, you should take medication. Don't call it your savior, but it could be something that could be helpful for you. And I was connected to a lot of those people, and so I stayed sane a little bit during that time. But I guess the issue that I came back to from all of my struggles was it was a struggle around what we thought God would allow a Christian to go through.
Right.
And I came up with this analogy this morning. You guys can tell me what you think of it. But in Islam, famously, they don't believe Jesus was crucified. And the reason for not believing Jesus is crucified, if you were to ask a faithful Muslim, is Allah would never allow a prophet to die in such a shameful way. That's part of the reason why they would deny the crucifixion, like this really corroborated historical fact.
Yeah.
Right? To me, the crowd in, especially like American evangelical, thought that would deny the reality of mental illness it feels eerily similar to that, where it says, well, we know God would never allow one of his children to suffer in such a shameful way, you know, in other words. And that was the vibe I was getting. And
and to be clear, like, you're not saying that people who have an uncomfortability with suffering are Islamic.
No.
But you're saying there's like a...
I'm saying that in the way that there's this belief, you know, that like, well, God wouldn't allow somebody to suffer that way.
Yeah.
Sometimes people can adopt similar thinking in their Christian faith and go, well, sure, God allows us to suffer, but up to a point, right?
And it's almost a prosperity gospel if you kind of play that out, you know? You're a faithful follower.
That's
of
probably
the Lord.
closer to what I mean. It's like this, well, you know, we know that we'll see God's children growing in joy and peace and all of these various things, and you're not experiencing that. You know what I mean? So what's wrong with you? Like, this isn't on God. God wouldn't allow this if there wasn't some other things going on.
Yeah, and uncomfortability with the, like, you know, the progression in James 1 where suffering leads in some way to your joy.
Yes.
Like, there's not a real system for that. In some
or
ways
even,
too.
Even the James passage, like, count it all joy, my brothers, you know? And it's like, okay, at what point in your suffering? Because he's talking about, you know, that you may become whole, you know what I mean? Complete. You may reach the completion of what it means.
That's a passage I'm talking about,
Okay, and you'll probably get into some of this, but the Greek word telos, it's like arriving at a full level of wholeness in your life, right? But that's a process. To be able to count it all joy, to get to a place of spiritual maturity and growth where you can look at your circumstances and say, wow, you know, God, I don't know why I'm going through this, but I trust you. I'm counting it as joy because I know this is going to form me into a person who looks like Jesus. But that's not, oftentimes that verse is unloaded onto people immediately beginning their suffering.
In the midst of it.
Or we associate joy primarily with the emotion, such that if we see somebody going through it really badly, we go, is this the kind of thing we think God, you know what I mean? Like a person who knows God and is filled with God's Spirit would be experiencing. Why would God allow that? You know what I mean? It's like, well, why did he allow his son to be crucified? Why did he allow all of his apostles to be martyred in really shameful, horrible ways? Why has he allowed Christians throughout the centuries to suffer immensely?
Yeah, and what I hear you saying is you're borrowing from something else besides the Bible to understand God that way. And that's true, right? Whether it's cultural zeitgeist or moment, right, of being like, hey, to be American is the pursuit of happiness, or, you know, the good life. And that's not always the biblical model for, you know, happiness is not always synonymous with being a Christian at times.
Right.
Because of the positions we're put in culturally, or even just like, we don't run away from sadness. You know, God says, like, look, I'm not going to teleport you through the valley of the shadow of death. I'm going to actually be with you. And I'm not going to guarantee that we're going to just rush through that bad boy.
Well, and the Apostle Paul will say in the book of Acts, through many sufferings, we must enter the kingdom of heaven, you know? So there's almost living in a world that is not the way God would have it, you know what I mean? That's not God's ideal. We're outside of the Garden of Eden, right? We're outside of the place where God's blessing is in its fullness. But God is with us nevertheless. But that by no means guarantees that we're not going to experience horrible, horrible tragedies. You know, I think of Elizabeth Elliot, you know, in her life and the amount of tragedy she went through. And she recounts a lot of stories of people saying to her, you know, this idea of, why would God allow you to be suffering so much if there wasn't some sin in your life? You know what I mean? And her going, he allowed his son to be crucified, you know, by the Romans. He'll allow a lot, you know, and that accomplished the salvation of everything.
Yeah, I remember Tim Keller saying, why would God allow you to prosper if there's sin in your life?
Right, yeah.
It's like, let's just not associate the two.
Yeah, right. No, totally. And so that, I think, kind of bringing it back, I'm glad we clarified that. I'm just saying there was this feeling in the sense of like, you must either not be doing all the things.
There's something you're doing wrong to
there's something either we're telling you to do that you're not doing, or something you're doing that you shouldn't be doing. And those are the direct causal reasons why you're experiencing what you're experiencing.
So how did that manifest in your community? Like, you know, did people start telling you that?
No, not explicitly, but and thankfully there were people who said the opposite to me. The problem was there was a sudden and noticeable lack of community. Community that we had formerly had, we felt began to kind of pull away a little bit, where there was this distance created at a time where I was like, hey, I need less distance, not, or more distance, not less distance. There were relationships with mentors that didn't, come to fruition the way they had in the past. And so it felt kind of like, this is eerily quiet for the amount of like explicit suffering we've shared with you that we're going through.
Right.
Well, walk us through next. What's the next season?
So 2020, we're walking through that. 2021, we find out we're pregnant and we're ecstatic. My wife said it felt like this little bubble of hope in this really horrible time. We do a genetic test just because we just want to know, hey, who's the little dude we're getting? What's going to be our life with them? And we find out that this little one has a genetic abnormality that's going to make it so that he does not make it past the second trimester. And so we have my suicide attempt, we have miscarriage. I had another kind of threatening attempt where I'd left home and said, I'm going to do it, prior to that. We suddenly have this withdrawal of community, and we don't know why at the time. We're just suddenly not, I'm being told, hey, we're not looking to have you serve currently, you know what I mean, in some of your previous roles. And I'm thinking, and by the way, there's a lot of health in stepping away from ministry roles when you're dealing with crisis. Chronic is a little different, but crisis especially. There's a wisdom there if you're told that, and if it's communicated to you that that's the reason. And so all of that's going on. We have this miscarriage, and I was like, that was when I hit like just this point of despair of like, maybe God is angry with me, like maybe this is. Maybe I am doing something wrong. Like, what is going on? And I had listened to like guys like Keller, you know what I mean, who had shown me a better way of thinking through this, of being like, no, like look at Job, look at Jesus, look at Paul. That can't be what it means, because he himself suffers, you know what I mean, indignation every day. So I was processing all of that, and then it felt like, more and more there was this pressure for me to be joyful. There was this pressure for me of like, I know you're suffering, you know what I mean? But come on, buck up, you know what I mean? We have joy in Christ, you know what I mean? We know the gospel. And it was like, I was trying, it was like somebody put a 10-foot rim in front of me and said, dunk the ball, and I was like, I'm really trying. Right. I just can't. And it feels like there's a moral grade attached to the fact that I can't do that. And so as time went on, we eventually just felt so alone that we began to look at what would it look like to worship elsewhere, where we feel that we can maybe get into community that can walk alongside us through this and not, for me especially, not feel like a pariah because I'm dealing with this. Because it is such a dehumanizing experience to be dealing with mental illness and then to feel like you're doing something, even if it's just, again, even if it's just a flavor, you know what I mean? Just a kind of whiff of like the way you're being perceived. It's really,
and that's such a public thing too, right? Yeah. A lot of time mental health is like behind closed doors, and you had sort of chest bared to your community and everyone around, and
especially opening then up and trying to invite people in and being like, here's what we're up against, you know what I mean? Here's what we're dealing with.
And people pulling away.
And people, feeling like they're pulling away, you know what I mean? Or getting burnt out, but it's like, you didn't really start in with us, so I'm not sure how you're like pulling out already, you know what I mean? And so I was, confused because I had been so involved for so long, and was wondering like what happened. And so some months went by, and I eventually was sat down by a fairly prominent person, and I was like, dude, what in the world is happening? And I was just told, hey, with regard to your roles serving, we were afraid that if we put you back out there, and you took your life, that would have an effect on the ministry. And that was the way it was worded. And I remember just kind of like mouth half open, like stunned, like, okay, I'm not sure how to process this right now. And it was something I processed through Regen, a lot of just this feeling of like, that felt like a very corporate decision, even though I know there's wisdom in asking people to step away, even though I know there was a loving version of that. There was a loving version of like, hey, we love you. We want you to be healthy. We want you
Right.
to experience wholeness in
Yeah.
your life. I don't feel comfortable putting you in a high position of pressure when you're undergoing, this crisis. We want to walk alongside you through
Yeah.
this.
I
And
think
you guys
that
are the
being
pastors.
the key thing, right? Where you
Right.
just, I want to
Care.
walk with you.
Care
Yeah.
for you
Right.
and the ministry.
Yeah, because ministry at bottom is caring for the image of God, which is what the Bible says human beings are. There's no greater act of worship in a lot of ways than to value other human beings and say, God, you've made them. They reflect
Yeah.
you, and we want to care for them because in that act, we're affirming your own worth. We're affirming that you are a good God.
Man. So, I mean, that's obviously like really sad.
Yeah.
But give us a snap. I mean, we're running up against our time here, and
Sure.
I'd love to just get a snapshot of from there to here, and then
Yeah.
I'd love to hear just a couple reflections from you
Yeah.
on like what you hope people hear and know and understand from your story.
Yeah.
And maybe from that point too, how can we better care for people walking through things like you were walking through?
Yeah.
And care for you.
Yeah. Thank you.
It's not over. So.
Yeah. Well, happily, God just in his goodness brought us to the Well Community Church, and I immediately, you could just feel it. You're like, people are talking about their struggles here. They got regen, you know what I mean? I met this Jordan guy. He's very vulnerable with me, and it was different. Like the vibe was just different, and I remember immediately feeling like I got some church hurt. I got some distrust for people in ministry, but I feel like I can work on that. I feel like I can sit in the back row at Fig for a little while with a cup of delicious coffee and just sort of quietly sing, and then found myself a few months later standing and singing, and then putting my hands up again in surrender to God, and then developing relationships and going through regen and finding a lot of like healing in community and finding a life group and being able to share like, hey, here's where I've been, and to have people like reach over with tears in their eyes and give you a hug and just be like, you're valued, you're wanted here. There's space for you to serve as you are in process, continuing every day to try to learn more about yourself. And to just suddenly sense that and to feel like, okay, God, so you're not like done. Like I'm not done because I went through all of this. Right. I can't even begin to describe just the fire that put in me. And so, it's unique to get to sit across from you and just say thank you for the role you've played in that. And just thankful for the way this church culture is here. And I think that brings me to one of my reflections, which is, there's a difference between an imperfect church, right? The Well Community Church is really great in a lot of ways, right? But it's not perfect. There's a difference between an imperfect church and an unhealthy church with regard to the issue of mental illness. And I would say if you're in a church where the concept of medication is like got this dark, like bum, 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 you know what I mean, to it when it comes up, that's probably a sign of unhealth, that we're not willing to embrace God's fully orbed way of healing us, his sovereignty over every field, including the medical field,
Yeah, common grace.
Grace, which the reformers were huge on, but a lot of people in their tradition often are not,
Yeah, common grace being that God is the author of all truth.
Right.
And we may not have chemistry in our Bible that leads to health,
right.
But he gives the truths of the universe that people who tap into that are actually tapping into God's truth as they do those things.
Psalm 145, his mercy is over everything that he's made. And Martin Luther famously said, the milkmaid and the minister alike care for the world God has made. And that goes for doctors and wise professionals in any field as well. So that's really big. Update for me, I'm on a new medication. I've been on it for about 10 days. I feel great. And this is when I'm supposed to be seeing some of the results of that. And so it was just funny getting ready to come on for this and feeling like, what are you doing? I'd been practicing some different spiritual practices over the last few months. Silence and solitude, more increased time of prayer, and had been finding just more and more God's love coming home in my heart and feeling a sense of like, stability, just even from that. And then to get this medication on the back of that has just been like, come on, this is awesome. Because it's been such a long 4 years of counseling and trying supplements and trying medication and trying everything and feeling like, it's not quite there. It's not quite there. It's not quite there. And then it's like the other shoe dropped and I get to come on and just say, praise God, because it's been a 4-year journey. It's been a longer journey than that. But there is some light, finally kind of coming through.
I remember Jamie said that like her medication did not just, zap and take away all of her anxiety. It created an environment inside her mind where she could actually submit her anxieties to God. Yeah. Where everything else was a spiral.
Yeah, right.
And now it's here's the reality of all the things I'm dealing with. Now I'm able to actually walk in these anxieties with Jesus, to where before she couldn't even felt like she couldn't get to the start line.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's such a beautiful picture holistically too. Yeah. That there is more than one thing here, which I think is what you're getting at.
Yeah.
To help with this healing journey.
Yeah. Some of the things Whitney and I reflected on: mental illness. The brain is an organ. It's a very important one. The mind is a weird realm because it's like the overlap of the physical and the spiritual, right? It's an organ. If you believe in concussions, congratulations, welcome to the conversation. You believe that the brain can be damaged and it affects things. But it also is the organ that can reach out to God's realm and receive from God and know God. You know what I mean? Love the Lord your God with all your mind. I mean, this is a really crucial part of Christian discipleship. And so we need to talk about how it's a both and. And so the total healing of mental illness isn't just a pill or another Bible verse. Ultimately, the healing of my mental illness, even though I'm having success with medication now, will be the hope of all of Scripture, which is new creation. The idea that the Bible's last pages end with a new heavens and a new earth, with God's people having new bodies, resurrection, bodies like Jesus that won't get sick or die, that won't experience sorrow, because all sorrow and death and presence of the fall will be banished forever. That ultimately is where I come back to again and again, is belief in that.
So we're kind of out of space here, but I do want to leave with just two things. One is what Melissa said earlier. If you can give sort of a brief, hey, if you are silently struggling, let me encourage you with this. And then if somebody is struggling, let me encourage you with this.
Yeah. Okay. If you're silently struggling, one of the things I would say is, if you are in a community where you feel like you can talk about that, please do. Please start mentioning it to people close to you who you can trust. And if you feel like, man, I got none of that, I don't have that community, probably the best first step is to go and talk to a counselor, really, somebody with mental health training who can walk you through some of that. But then we're made for community. We come from community. God is himself an inner community of love and cherishing. And so for you to get into something like a life group, or a regen, some environment where you're going to be able to process this in community with other people, don't keep it to yourself. Really, these things get harder in the dark. And when we step into community and we just acknowledge, because it's not a moral thing. You haven't done anything morally wrong. You're suffering with an effect of living in a world that's not as it was meant to be. And God knows that, and he loves you. And so what needs to happen next is you to be able to be around people who can be with you, who can do very basic things like, hey, can I take you out to lunch?
Yeah.
Can we go see a movie? Can I... We don't have to just talk about your depression the whole time. We can actually, I can love you. We can invite you to the game night. We know you'll be a little maybe morose. You know what I mean? We know that we're going to invite you in anyway.
Yeah.
So
and I guess that leads right into the thing for if you know somebody who's, go ahead.
Well, can
Sorry.
I just say, and I know I'm the Wells Life Group director. So obviously
Melissa
love
paid
that
me
you bring
before
that
this
up. But as you were sharing your story, I was thinking, I think Jackie Hill Perry said it this way, that you're wounded in community and you're healed in community.
Yeah.
So yes, step into community.
Yeah.
It won't be perfect, but what a great next step.
Yeah,
So
because
thanks
even
for
like I
sharing
shared with my story, I was wounded in community in a really deep way, but I've been healed in community. And it makes sense. You can lose your faith in one church without losing your faith in the church, because this is the place Jesus has said, I'm going to sanctify my bride. I'm going to wash her with water. You know what I mean? And that means that sanctification really only happens, and healing only happens in community. And so that has to be a part of, again, fully orbed, right? Medication may be something you need, counseling for sure, but community with God's people, worshiping, being reminded of our hope.
So if someone's in community with someone who's struggling, what advice would you give them just to close up here?
Know that it's going to be really difficult. You're going to try things and you're going to feel like they're hitting a wall a lot of times, and you're going to feel discouraged by that. But keep doing it because eventually, I mean, you are what you're trying to do in loving somebody going through that is you're trying to open all of the shutters in the house and letting little bits of light in, and acts of love, very carefully timed words of encouragement, you know what I mean, that are not trying to fix the problem, but are just trying to remind them, hey, we love you, you know, God loves you. We have a hope on the horizon, but we're here with you in the meantime, and God's here with you in the meantime. I would say, especially, you know, if you're dealing with someone in crisis, there are resources to reach out to. You do not have to handle that on your own, and you shouldn't try to. But with somebody with chronic mental illness, a lot of it is just, how do I continue to remind them, to rehumanize them, because they're going to feel very dehumanized. And it could be simple acts. Let's go get a taco. Let's go, let's watch this thing, you know, let's hang out, come to our life group dinner. You know what I mean? It could also be, would you sit with me in church? You know, would you come with me on Sunday mornings? Little things like that. But just keeping them close, because the lie they're hearing more than anything else is nobody wants you. And to have somebody repeatedly say, I don't know what that guy's saying, but we love you and we want you. I mean, that is the image of God stuff right there, is telling the serpent, you quiet, you know, this is what God says about you. And not trying to fix it, genuinely allowing God to be the great healer, but you just get to be the person who gets to be that vessel.
That's beautiful.
Reminder of his love. Yeah.
That's beautiful.
Well, thanks for joining us, man.
Thanks for
really
having me.
appreciate it.
It was helpful.
Well, hey, thank you guys for listening. We hope that this was enriching to you. And, you know, if you have any recommended resources, anything that you can point them to, sometimes we do that at the end of the episode as well.
Two quick things. One would just be, there's a Christian artist named Renzema. He came out with an album recently called Manna, where he actually processes a lot of his struggle with mental illness as a Christian. It's phenomenal. And they use the imagery of manna in the desert, of just feeling like you're getting just enough to keep going. It was really powerful. It's brought me to tears multiple times. I can't talk about it more, otherwise it will. And then there's a great book, like I mentioned, about Our Hope is New Creation, book by a theologian named N.T. Wright, called Surprised by Hope. And I highly recommend that as well, just as a reminder of what we're headed towards. We're headed toward a future free of death in the fall.
That's awesome. Well, thank you, Austin.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Excited to talk with you in the future again, maybe, you know?
Yeah.
And I hope you guys enjoyed this. Please share it with a friend, anybody else who you want to talk through this with. And if you are struggling, we just ask that you reach out. Don't do it alone. And so we'll talk to you next time on the WellCast.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the WellCast. As always, don't forget to subscribe and tell your friends about us. For more information about the Well Community Church, visit thewellcommunity.org.